March 4th, 1944. 0600 hours. Royal Air Force Debden, Essex, England. Staff Sergeant Glessner Weckbacher stood under the left wing of a P-51B Mustang, watching his pilot prepare for a mission deeper into Germany than any single-engine fighter had ever gone. The pilot was Captain Dominic Gentile, 23 years old, former Royal Air Force Eagle Squadron veteran, son of Italian immigrants from Piqua, Ohio. In 6 hours, Gentile would be flying to Berlin, over 1,100 miles round trip, escorting B-17 bombers to the Nazi capital. If everything went perfectly, he might survive. Weckbacher had been a crew chief with the 4th Fighter Group's 336th Fighter Squadron for 18 months. He knew aircraft maintenance inside and out. He understood what these machines could and could not do. The P-51 Mustang sitting in front of him was different from anything the 8th Air Force had ever fielded. Single-engine fighter, inline rolls, Royce Merlin engine, sleek laminar flow wing, fast and deadly at altitude. But what made this airplane revolutionary was not its speed or its climb rate. It was something far simpler. It could fly to Berlin and back without running out of fuel. No other American fighter could do that. Not the P-38 Lightning, not the P-47 Thunderbolt, only the Mustang. The problem was that nobody had actually proven it yet. This would be the first time. And if it failed, if the fuel calculations were wrong, if the drop tanks did not work as planned, if anything went wrong at all, dozens of pilots would run out of fuel over Germany and die. American bomber crews had been dying for 18 months. Good men, thousands of them, kids really. They climbed into their B-17s with confidence and came back in boxes, or did not come back at all. The 8th Air Force Command said the problem was German fighters. The Germans were too strong, too aggressive, too numerous. American doctrine said the bombers could defend themselves with massed firepower. Fly in tight formation, concentrate your defensive guns. German fighters could not penetrate. The manual said it worked. The statistics said otherwise. On August 17, 1943, 376 B-17 Flying Fortresses attacked the Messerschmitt factory at Regensburg and the ball-bearing plants at Schweinfurt. Both targets were deep in southern Germany, beyond the range of P-47 Thunderbolt escorts. The bombers went in alone. The Luftwaffe was waiting. They hit the American formations the moment the escorts turned back. Wave after wave of Messerschmitt, Bf-109s, and Focke-Wulf 190. Fighters tore into the bomber groups. Head-on attacks at closing speeds of 600 miles per hour. Cannon fire ripping through cockpits and wings. Bombers exploding in midair. Crews bailing out over occupied territory. 60 bombers were lost that day. Over 500. 50 crewmen missing. Every one of those aircraft had followed doctrine perfectly. Tight formation, concentrated defensive fire, everything by the book. They died anyway. The second Schweinfurt raid came 2 months later. October 14th, 1943. Black Thursday. The 8th Air Force sent 291 B-17s back to the same target. They had rebuilt their strength. They had trained replacement crews. They had refined their tactics. It did not matter. The Luftwaffe shot down 60 more bombers. 650 men killed, wounded, or missing. Over 20% loss rate in a single mission. The 8th Air Force lost air superiority over Germany that day. They could not sustain those losses. They could not replace aircraft and crews fast enough. Deep penetration raids into Germany were suspended until a solution could be found. The bomber offensive, the entire strategy of bringing Nazi Germany to its knees through strategic bombing, was failing. Not because of poor tactics, not because of inadequate training, because American fighters could not escort the bombers all the way to the target and back. The P-47 Thunderbolt was a magnificent aircraft, rugged, heavily armed, capable of taking enormous damage and bringing pilots home. But it had a combat radius of less than 400 miles with internal fuel. With external drop tanks, maybe 550 miles. Berlin was 600 miles from England. The math did not work. The P-38 Lightning had the range, technically. Twin engines, twin fuselage booms, plenty of internal fuel capacity. But Lightning production was limited, and most of the aircraft went to the Pacific and Mediterranean theaters. The 8th Air Force in England never had enough of them. And the P-38 had problems at high altitude in the cold European weather. Engine failures, control issues, pilots freezing in the cockpit. It was not the answer. What the 8th Air Force needed was a fighter that could fly to Berlin, fight the Luftwaffe over the target, and fly back to England. A fighter that could stay with the bombers for the entire mission. A fighter that combined range, speed, altitude performance, and firepower. That fighter did not exist in 1943. Then in November, the 354th Fighter Group received the first P-51B Mustangs in England. The Mustang had been around since 1942. Originally powered by an Allison Phi 1710 engine, the early Mustangs were good low-altitude fighters used by the Royal Air Force for ground attack and reconnaissance, but they were inadequate at the 20,000 to 30,000 foot altitudes where the bomber battles happened. The Allison engine could not produce enough power in thin air. The breakthrough came when someone installed a British Rolls-Royce Merlin engine in the Mustang airframe. The Merlin had a two-stage, two-speed supercharger that gave exceptional high altitude performance. The combination of the Mustang's aerodynamic design and the Merlin's power created something extraordinary. At 30,000 feet, the P-51B could reach 440 miles per hour. It could outclimb German fighters. It could outturn them at high speed. And with external drop tanks, it had the range to go anywhere. Colonel Donald Blakesley saw the potential immediately. Blakesley commanded the 4th Fighter Group at Debden. He was 26 years old, one of the most experienced American fighter pilots in Europe. He had flown with the Royal Air Force Eagle squadrons before America entered the war. He had fought the Luftwaffe since 1941. He had logged over 800 combat hours by January 1944. He knew what worked and what did not. Blakesley hated the P-47 Thunderbolt. It was too big, too heavy, too limited in range. His pilots were dying because they could not stay with the bombers deep into Germany. When Blakesley saw the P-51 Mustang for the first time in December 1943, he knew this was the aircraft that could change the war. He flew 6 missions with the 354th Fighter Group to evaluate the Mustang. He came back convinced. On January 1st, 1944, Blakesley took command of the 4th Fighter Group. His first priority was getting Mustangs. He went to Major General William Kepner, commander of 8th Fighter Command. Blakesley made his case. The P-51 could escort bombers all the way to any target in Germany. It could engage enemy fighters on equal or better terms. It could fly higher and faster than anything the Luftwaffe had. Kepner was skeptical. The 4th Fighter Group was one of the premier fighter units in England. Converting to a new aircraft meant taking the group offline for weeks while pilots trained. Blakesley made a promise. Give me the Mustangs, and I will have the group combat ready in 24 hours. Kepner agreed. The first P-51s arrived at Debden on February 28, 1944. Blakesley flew the lead aircraft in himself. The ground crew started working immediately, checking engines, loading ammunition, installing drop tanks. The pilots got minimal familiarization. Most had less than 1 hour flying time in the Mustang before their first combat mission. Some had as little as 40 minutes. There was no time for extensive training. The bombers needed escorts now. Captain Dominic Gentile had been with the 4th Fighter Group since September 1942, when the Eagle squadrons transferred to the United States Army Air Forces. He was a natural pilot. As a teenager in Ohio, his father had bought him his own airplane. Gentile logged over 300 hours before joining the Royal Canadian Air Force in 1941. He flew Spitfires with 133 Eagle Squadron, scoring 2 victories before the transfer. He had flown P-47s for over a year, claiming 4 more kills. But Gentile, like all the Eagle Squadron veterans, preferred the Merlin engine. The Spitfire had a Merlin. Now the Mustang had a Merlin. It felt like coming home. Gentile had maybe 1 hour in the Mustang before the Berlin mission briefing. He was a good pilot, experienced, aggressive. He and his wingman John Godfrey were already becoming famous as the most effective fighter team in the 8th Air Force. Winston Churchill would later call them the Damon and Pythias of the 20th century, but the Mustang was different from anything Gentile had flown. It handled differently. The controls felt lighter. The visibility was better with the bubble canopy. Everything about it required adjustment. 1 hour was not enough time to become proficient. It would have to do. On the evening of March 3rd, the 4th Fighter Group received the mission briefing. The target was Berlin. Over 800 B-17 and B-24 bombers would attack German aircraft factories in and around the capital. The mission required fighter escort for the entire route, inbound and outbound, over 600 miles each way. The 4th Fighter Group would provide part of that escort, joining the bomber stream over central Germany and staying with them through the target area. The briefing room went silent when the intelligence officer pulled the curtain back from the mission map. A red line stretched from Debden across the English Channel, across Holland, across northern Germany, all the way to Berlin. No American single-engine fighter had ever flown that far into Germany. Most of the pilots in that room had never been past the Rhine River. Berlin was 300 miles beyond that, deep in the heart of Nazi Germany, the most heavily defended city in Europe. The key to the mission was fuel management. Each P-51B carried 184 gallons of fuel in internal wing tanks and an 85-gallon fuselage tank behind the cockpit. That was enough for maybe 400 miles of combat radius, But each Mustang would also carry 2 external drop tanks under the wings, 108-gallon capacity each. Paper construction, made in England by companies that normally manufactured cardboard boxes. These tanks would give the Mustang an additional 216 gallons of fuel, enough to extend range to over 750 miles. The fuel management sequence was critical. Take off on internal wing fuel. Climb to altitude using wing fuel in the fuselage tank. Switch to drop tanks after crossing into occupied Europe. Burn the drop tanks completely before reaching the combat area. Drop the empty tanks. Fight on internal fuel only. Return to England on whatever fuel remained. If any step failed, if the drop tanks did not feed properly, if pilots switched tanks at the wrong time, if fuel consumption was higher than calculated, pilots would run out of fuel over Germany and die. Gentile studied the mission profile carefully that evening. The Mustang's fuselage tank affected the aircraft's center of gravity when full. The manual said not to engage in combat with fuel in the fuselage tank. The aircraft would be tail-heavy and difficult to maneuver. You had to burn the fuselage tank first, then the drop tanks, then the wing tanks. Miss that sequence, and you might win the dogfight but run out of fuel on the way home. Get it right, and you had a chance. Staff Sergeant Weckbacher worked on Gentile's aircraft through the night. The Mustang was mechanically sound. The Merlin engine ran perfectly. The guns were bore-sighted and loaded with 400 rounds per gun for the 50 caliber machine guns and 200 rounds for the 20mm cannon. The drop tanks were installed and tested. The fuel system checked out. Everything was ready. But Weckbacher had been a crew chief long enough to know that everything being ready did not mean everything would go right. He had watched too many pilots fly out on perfect aircraft and not come back. The bomber crews called Germany the most dangerous place on Earth. And now fighter pilots would be flying 1,100 miles deep into that hell in single-engine aircraft that could not survive a single bullet in the cooling system. Weckbacher said nothing. He signed off the maintenance log and watched the sun rise over the airfield. At 0530 hours on March 4th, the pilots began their pre-flight briefing. Weather over Germany would be clear, visibility unlimited, the Luftwaffe would be up in force. Intelligence estimated 200 German fighters would intercept, maybe more. Tactics for the mission were straightforward. Maintain formation with the bombers. Stay close. Engage enemy fighters only if they attacked the bombers or your formation. The primary mission was bomber protection, not fighter sweeps. Bring the bombers home. Colonel Blakesley would lead the mission. His call sign was horseback. He briefed the fuel management sequence again, emphasized it, repeated it, made sure every pilot understood. Run your fuselage tank on takeoff and climb. Switch to drop tanks at 10,000 feet over the channel. Burn them completely before you reach the combat area. Drop the tanks, whether they are empty or not, before engaging enemy fighters. Fight on wing fuel only. If you do not follow this sequence exactly, you will die over Germany. At 0645, the pilots walked out to their aircraft. Weckbacher watched Gentile do his pre-flight inspection. Check the control surfaces, the landing gear, the drop tanks, the gun bays. Everything normal. Gentile climbed into the cockpit. Weckbacher helped him strap in, checked his parachute harness, plugged in his radio and oxygen connections. Gentile's Mustang bore the name Shangri-La painted on the nose. It would become one of the most famous P-51s of the war. At 0700 hours, the first Mustang engine started. The Merlin had a distinctive sound, a deep-throated roar that made the ground shake. One after another, engines came to life. The noise was overwhelming. Weckbacher stood on the flight line and watched the Mustangs taxi toward the runway. They looked sleek and deadly, silver aluminum gleaming in the morning sun, drop tanks hanging heavy under the wings. They looked like the future of fighter aviation. Weckbacher hoped they were. Blakesley led the takeoff. His Mustang lifted off at 0720 and climbed into the gray English sky. The rest of the group followed, aircraft launching in pairs, forming up into flights and squadrons. Within minutes, Mustangs were airborne, climbing toward their rendezvous point with the bomber stream over the North Sea. What happened in the next 8 hours would change the air war over Europe forever. Captain Dominic Gentile had never been to Berlin. None of the 4th Fighter Group pilots had. Berlin was the forbidden city, the target that was too far, too dangerous, too heavily defended. American bombers had tried to reach it in daylight and failed. The losses were too high. The escorts could not go that far. Berlin was supposed to be untouchable. Today, that would change. The bomber stream appeared over the North Sea at 0815. Hundreds of aircraft, miles of sky filled with B-17s and B-24s flying in tight combat boxes. Each box contained 18 to 21 bombers, stacked vertically and horizontally to maximize defensive firepower. From a distance, they looked like a massive armada, organized and powerful. Up close, you could see the individual aircraft, the names painted on their noses, the mission markings, the patches in the aluminum skin from previous battles. These aircraft had been to Germany before. Many had barely survived. They were going back. Gentile joined the bomber stream over Holland. The Mustangs slotted into escort positions, flights of 4 aircraft above and beside the bomber formations. The tactics were simple. Stay close, watch for enemy fighters, protect the bombers at all costs. The Luftwaffe would come. Everyone knew it. The question was when and where and how many. The fuel situation was working as planned. Gentile burned his fuselage tank during climb out, switched to drop tanks over the channel, and watched the fuel gauge carefully as he flew east. The drop tanks fed normally, no leaks, no pressure problems. So far, everything was perfect, but perfection in combat never lasted. The first German fighters appeared at 0930, 50 miles west of Hanover. Bf-109s, multiple squadrons, maybe 40 aircraft. They dove on the bomber formations from 25,000 feet, standard German tactics. High-speed slashing attacks, fire and break away before the defensive guns could track effectively. The formation leaders called out the bandits. The Mustang pilots climbed to intercept. Gentile pushed his throttle forward and felt the Merlin respond instantly. The Mustang accelerated like nothing he had ever flown. Within seconds, he was at combat speed, closing on the German fighters. The engagement lasted several minutes. The Bf-109s made their attack runs on the bombers. Several B-17s took hits. One started smoking, fell out of formation, tried to make it home alone. It would not make it. The Mustangs tore into the German formation. Gentile got shots at a 109 climbing away from a bomber. The German fighter rolled and dove away. Gentile did not follow. His job was to stay with the bombers. The 109s broke off. Too many Mustangs, too aggressive. The Germans climbed away and regrouped. They would try again later. Gentile checked his fuel. The drop tanks were almost empty. He switched back to wing tanks, pulled the emergency release handle, felt the tanks separate and fall away. The Mustang felt lighter immediately, cleaner, faster. He was fighting on internal fuel now. Everything from here on would be measured in minutes and gallons. At 1000 hours, the bomber stream crossed into the Berlin defense zone. The flak started immediately. Black puffs of 88mm anti-aircraft fire filled the sky. The flak batteries knew the altitude and airspeed of the formations. They could put a box barrage exactly where the bombers would be. The only defense was to fly through it and hope. Gentile saw a B-17 take a direct hit. The entire nose section disintegrated. The bomber fell away spinning, pieces of aircraft and crew tumbling through the air. Nobody got out. Berlin appeared ahead through the haze. Gentile had seen London from the air many times. Berlin looked different, bigger, more spread out, industrial. The city stretched for miles in every direction. Factories, rail yards, residential areas, government buildings. This was the heart of Nazi Germany. This was the place no American fighter was supposed to reach. And now Mustangs were flying over it at 26,000 feet. The bombers began their bomb runs. The lead groups opened their bomb bay doors, lined up on their targets, flew straight and level while the bombardiers took aim. This was the most dangerous part of any mission. The aircraft could not maneuver during the bomb run. They were completely vulnerable to flak and fighters. The bombardiers called out their adjustments, left, right, steady, bombs away. The B-17s lurched upward as tons of high explosive fell toward the city below. The Luftwaffe hit the formation with everything they had. Over 100 German fighters attacked from multiple directions simultaneously. Focke-Wulf 190As, Bf-109s, Me-210 twin-engine destroyers. They came in fast and aggressive, pressing their attacks despite the Mustang cover. Several bombers went down. Others took heavy damage. The Mustangs engaged the German fighters wherever they could, breaking up attacks, forcing the enemy to fight defensively, instead of focusing on the bombers. The bomber stream turned for home at 10:40. The surviving aircraft closed up their formations, the gaps where lost bombers had been painfully obvious. Behind them, Berlin burned. Smoke rose thousands of feet into the air. The mission had hit its targets. But the cost was high. The flight back to England was a running battle. German fighters pursued the bomber stream across Germany, hitting damaged stragglers, trying to bring down more bombers before they reached the relative safety of Allied fighter range. The Mustang pilots stayed with their charges, fighting off attacks, conserving fuel, watching their gauges tick down toward empty. At 1200 hours, the bomber stream crossed the Dutch coast, heading west. The German fighters broke off. They were at the limit of their fuel range. The bombers and Mustangs continued alone over the North Sea. Gentile's fuel gauge showed enough to make it home, barely. The 4th Fighter Group landed at Debden between 1245 and 1300 hours. Gentile touched down with fuel to spare. He taxied to his parking spot, shut down the engine, sat in the cockpit for a moment, trying to process what had just happened. He had just flown to Berlin and back. He had fought German fighters over the Nazi capital. He had protected bombers deeper into Germany than anyone thought possible. And he was still alive. Weckbacher was waiting at the aircraft when Gentile climbed out. The crew chief said nothing. He just checked over the Mustang, looking for damage, counting the holes. A few hits in the wings, nothing critical. Gentile watched Weckbacher work and realized that the crew chief had believed in the aircraft. The fuel calculations, the drop tanks, the range extension, all of it. Weckbacher had known this would work. Now everyone else would too. What neither of them realized was that the mission they had just completed would break the Luftwaffe's will to fight. The Germans had known American bombers were coming to Berlin. They always knew. Their radar network tracked every formation from takeoff. They scrambled fighters, positioned flak batteries, prepared for the attack. What they did not expect was American fighters over Berlin, single-engine fighters, flying 600 miles from England, fighting at full combat effectiveness. That should not have been possible. Everyone knew single-engine fighters did not have that kind of range. The Luftwaffe had studied American aircraft. They knew the P-47s could not reach Berlin. They knew the P-38s were rare and had problems. They knew the new P-51s existed, but assumed they had the same limitations as other fighters. Drop tanks could only do so much. The physics did not work, except the physics did work. The Mustang with 108-gallon drop tanks could fly 750 miles combat radius. Berlin was 600 miles from England. The Mustang could reach it, fight for 30 minutes over the target, and return to base with fuel to spare. The Germans did not believe this until they saw it with their own eyes. Oberst Adolf Galland commanded Luftwaffe fighter operations in Western Europe. He was 32 years old, one of Germany's top aces with over 90 confirmed victories. He had been fighting Allied aircraft since 1940. He knew their capabilities intimately. When initial reports came in about American P-51 Mustangs over Berlin, Galland dismissed them as errors, probably P-38s misidentified, possibly a few aircraft that wandered off course and stumbled over Berlin accidentally. No way were American fighters flying there deliberately on escort missions. Then more reports came in, multiple sightings, dozens of American fighters, engaging German interceptors aggressively, staying with bomber formations for extended periods. Galland reviewed the intelligence carefully. The reports were consistent. Mustangs were definitely over Berlin. If the reports were accurate, this changed everything. But Galland needed confirmation. He needed to see it himself. On March 6th, Galland and another German general flew to intercept the next American bomber raid. They wanted to see these American fighters for themselves. They wanted to verify that Allied aircraft could really reach Berlin. They assumed they would find confused enemy pilots flying lost aircraft. They were wrong. The Americans found them first. P-51 Mustangs dove on Galland and the other general from above. The Mustangs were fast, aggressive, and clearly operating at full combat capability. These were not lost aircraft wandering aimlessly over Germany. These were American fighters on a planned escort mission, hunting German interceptors. Galland and the other general split up and tried to evade. The Mustangs pursued. The other general's aircraft was shot down. Galland escaped by firing his guns forward, creating a cloud of gun smoke and spent brass that fooled the pursuing Mustangs into thinking they were being attacked from behind. They broke off. Galland escaped. The other general did not. Both were shaken. The Americans really could reach Berlin. This was not an aberration. This was the new reality. Galland reported to Reichsmarschall Hermann Göring immediately. Göring commanded the entire Luftwaffe. He was Hitler's second in command. He had been a fighter pilot in World War I, a skilled commander, a political survivor. But by 1944, he was out of touch with the actual situation in the air war. He believed the Luftwaffe was still winning. He believed American losses were unsustainable. He believed German fighters controlled the skies over the Reich. Galland's report shattered those beliefs. According to official United States Air Force Europe interrogation summaries, when Göring learned that American single-engine fighters had escorted bombers to Berlin, he stated that when fighters actually appeared over Berlin for the first time, he knew that the eventual results would be tragic for Germany. Long-range fighters were the most decisive factor in the outcome of the air war. The Mustang's capability came as a complete surprise to him. Göring was right. The arrival of the P-51 Mustang as a long-range escort fighter fundamentally changed the strategic situation. For 18 months, the Luftwaffe had successfully defended German airspace by attacking unescorted bombers. German fighters waited until Allied escorts reached their fuel limits and turned back. Then they hit the bombers without opposition. It worked perfectly. American losses were staggering. But now American fighters could escort the bombers anywhere. There was nowhere in Germany the Luftwaffe could hide. Every target was vulnerable. Every city could be bombed with fighter protection. The defense of the Reich had failed. The psychological impact on German fighter pilots was severe. For 3 years, they had owned the sky in defensive operations. They knew they could outfight bombers. They knew they could defeat fighter escorts by forcing them to turn back. That confidence was breaking down. Pilots who used to press attacks were becoming hesitant. They were not sure anymore if American fighters would leave or stay. They were not sure if engaging the escorts would work or get them killed. The Luftwaffe was losing its aggressive edge. German pilots tried to adapt. Some avoided the Mustangs entirely and only attacked bombers when escorts were absent. But the escorts were never absent anymore. The P-51s stayed with the bombers all the way to target and all the way home. There were no gaps in coverage. Other German pilots became more aggressive, closing to shorter ranges, taking more risks, trying to shoot down bombers before the escorts could intercept. But increased aggression without tactical advantage just meant dying faster. Several experienced German aces were killed in March and April trying tactics that had worked perfectly in 1943. The fundamental problem for the Luftwaffe was that they were fighting an enemy they could not counter. The P-51 was faster than German fighters at altitude. It had longer range. It was more heavily armed. It had better high-altitude performance, and it was being produced in massive numbers. By April 1944, most of the 8th Air Force fighter groups were flying Mustangs. Hundreds of them. They were everywhere, all the time, escorting every mission. The Germans could not shoot them all down. They could not avoid them. They could not outfight them. The Luftwaffe was being worn down, mission by mission, day by day, until there was nothing left. In March 1944, the 8th Air Force lost 64 fighters over Germany. The Luftwaffe lost almost 300 fighters in the same period, many to Mustangs. In April, the ratio got worse. In May, worse still. By June 1944, the Luftwaffe was losing 2 to 3 fighters for every American fighter shot down. The kill ratio had reversed completely. The hunters had become the hunted. On June 6, 1944, the Allies invaded Normandy. Over 15,000 Allied aircraft supported the invasion. The Luftwaffe sent fewer than 100 fighters to contest it. They had lost so many aircraft and pilots in the previous 3 months that they could not mount an effective defense. Allied air superiority was total. American and British fighters flew over the invasion beaches unopposed. German ground forces fought without air support, their positions bombed and strafed continuously. The Normandy invasion succeeded in part because the Luftwaffe had been destroyed in the air war over Germany, and the P-51 Mustang was the aircraft that destroyed it. The modification that made this possible was remarkably simple. The P-51B already had good range with its internal fuel. 184 gallons in the wings, 85 gallons in the fuselage tank. But it was the addition of the 108-gallon external drop tanks that changed everything. Those tanks were not made of metal. They were made of paper. Kraft paper laminated with resorcinol glue, formed over wooden molds, hardened into cylindrical shapes 100 inches long. They looked crude. They looked like something you would ship products in, not something you would hang on a fighter aircraft. But they worked. The paper tanks were manufactured in England by companies that normally made cardboard boxes and industrial packaging. They were cheap to produce, light in weight, and did not require scarce strategic metals. They could hold fuel for 5 to 6 hours before the glue began to break down and the tanks started leaking. That was long enough for a mission to Berlin and back. The tanks were single use. Once dropped, they were gone. But that was acceptable. They cost almost nothing to make. American factories could produce them by the thousands. The installation was straightforward. Each tank mounted on a bomb rack under the wing. Fuel lines connected to the main fuel system. A pressure line ensured the fuel would flow at altitude. A manual release handle in the cockpit allowed the pilot to jettison the tanks when empty. The entire system added minimal weight and drag when the tanks were empty and about to be dropped. When full, the tanks degraded performance slightly. But the extended range made that trade-off worthwhile. The development of the paper drop tank was not dramatic. No brilliant engineer had a breakthrough insight. No laboratory discovered new technology. It was a simple solution to a simple problem. Fighters needed more fuel. Metal tanks were in short supply. Paper was available. Someone tried making a tank out of paper, and it worked. That was all. But that simple solution helped win the war. The credit for the Mustang's success is usually given to the pilots. They were the ones who flew the missions, fought the battles, brought the bombers home, and they deserve that credit. But the pilots could not have done their job without the crew chiefs who maintained the aircraft, the engineers who designed the fuel systems, the factory workers who built the drop tanks, the supply sergeants who made sure everything was available when needed. The Mustang was a system, not just an airplane. Every part of that system had to work perfectly every time or people died. Staff Sergeant Glesner Weckbacher worked on P-51 Mustangs from February 1944 until the end of the war. He maintained engines, repaired battle damage, loaded ammunition, installed drop tanks. He did pre-flight inspections at 0500 hours and post-flight maintenance until midnight. He worked through rain, cold, mud, and exhaustion. He never flew a combat mission. He never shot down an enemy aircraft. His name appears in maintenance logs and unit rosters, but rarely in history books. But he kept the aircraft flying, and that made everything else possible. Weckbacher maintained aircraft for multiple pilots over the course of the war. He was crew chief for Lieutenant Joseph Higgins, whose P-51B Minor Kleiner became famous in the squadron. He worked on Colonel Everett Stewart's Sunny 8 after Stewart took command of the 4th Fighter Group in February 1945. Weckbacher participated in Operation Frantic II, the Russia shuttle mission in June and July 1944, maintaining aircraft at forward bases thousands of miles from England. He was promoted to Staff Sergeant on April 1st, 1943, and served with the 4th Fighter Group until August 26, 1945. Captain Dominic Gentile became one of the most famous American fighter pilots of World War II. The March 4th mission was just the beginning. Weather had disrupted that first attempt. Only 31 bombers from the 13th Combat Wing actually reached Berlin that day due to a snowstorm. But the Mustangs had proven they could make the trip. That was enough. 2 days later, on March 6th, the weather cleared. The 8th Air Force launched the first major daylight bombing raid on Berlin. 660 bombers took off from England, escorted by over 150 P-51 Mustangs. This was the mission that truly demonstrated American air power over the German capital. Colonel Blakesley led the 4th Fighter Group again. The bombers hit their targets. The Mustangs engaged German fighters across the Berlin defense zone. The 4th Fighter Group claimed 13 victories that day. American losses were acceptable. The mission was a complete success. But March 8th was Gentile's Day. The 8th Air Force launched another massive raid on Berlin. Over 600 bombers, again escorted by Mustangs all the way to the target. Gentile was leading a section of fighters from the 330, 6th Squadron, when he spotted a flight of bombers under attack by approximately 50 enemy fighters. The odds were overwhelming. Gentile had only his wingman, John Godfrey, for support. Any sane pilot would have called for help and waited for reinforcements. Gentile attacked immediately. He dove into the German formation without hesitation. The Bf-109s scattered, surprised by the aggressive American fighters cutting through their attack formation. Gentile got his gun sight on the first 109. He fired. The German fighter exploded. Gentile reversed hard, looking for the next target. Another 109 crossed in front of him. Gentile fired again. Hits sparkled along the fuselage and wing. The German fighter rolled inverted and fell away smoking. The fight turned into a swirling dogfight over Berlin. Gentile and Godfrey working together, covering each other, executing the tactics they had perfected over months of combat. Whoever saw a target first took the lead. The other covered his six. It was fluid, aggressive, and devastatingly effective. Gentile got his gun sight on a third 109. Close range, maybe 200 feet. He pressed the trigger. The Mustang's 6 guns hammered. The 109 came apart in midair. Pieces of aircraft tumbled past Gentile's canopy. 3 confirmed kills in one mission, plus 1 shared with Godfrey. The Distinguished Service Cross citation would later read that Captain Gentile, with only his wingman as support and without regard to the overwhelming odds against him, immediately attacked the enemy formation and by extremely courageous flying and skillful gunnery destroyed 3 enemy planes. His actions broke up the attack on the bombers and saved American lives. General Dwight Eisenhower would personally award Gentile the Distinguished Service Cross at a ceremony at Debden on April 11th. Eisenhower called Gentile a one-man Air Force. The press loved him. Reporters followed him everywhere. His photograph appeared in newspapers across America. He was becoming the face of American fighter aviation in Europe. And his Mustang, Shangri-La with its distinctive markings, became one of the most recognizable aircraft of the war. He and his wingman John Godfrey formed the most effective fighter team in the 8th Air Force. Hermann Goering reportedly called them the Debden Gangsters and swore he would trade 2 squadrons for their capture. By April 1944, Gentile had become the leading American ace in Europe, with over 27 confirmed victories. On April 13th, reporters gathered at Debden to film Gentile landing, after what was supposed to be his final combat mission before rotation home. Gentile decided to demonstrate the Mustang's maneuverability with a low-level aerobatic display. He came in too low on a buzz job and crash-landed Shangri-La on the airfield. Gentile was uninjured, but the aircraft was destroyed. Colonel Blakesley, who had established a strict rule that anyone who pranged his kite would be grounded and sent home, immediately grounded Gentile. Gentile returned to the United States on a war bond tour. His final tally was 19.83 aerial victories, 6 ground kills, and 3 damaged. After the war, Gentile stayed in the Air Force as a test pilot at Wright Field and later as a training officer. On January 28, 1951, 30-year-old Don Gentile was killed when his T-33 trainer crashed in Forestville, Maryland. He left behind his wife Isabella and 3 young sons. He was buried with full military honors in St. Joseph Cemetery in Lockbourne, Ohio. A street at Seymour Johnson Air Force Base is named in his honor. Colonel Donald Blakesley flew over 500 combat missions between 1941 and 1944. He accumulated over 1,000 combat hours, more than any other American fighter pilot in World War II. He led the 4th Fighter Group through some of the heaviest fighting of the air war. He personally led the first shuttle mission to Russia in June 1944, a 1,500-mile flight that required 19 navigation charts crammed into his cockpit. He flew the mission perfectly. When he returned to Debden, he was a hero. In September 1944, after more than 3 years of continuous combat, Blakesley was ordered home for leave. He flew 3 more missions in October. On October 30th, General Kepner grounded him. The 8th Air Force had lost too many experienced leaders that month. Kepner could not afford to lose Blakesley, too. Blakesley was devastated. He returned to the United States in November. The 4th Fighter Group had the highest kill count of any American fighter group in Europe by the end of the war. 1,016 German aircraft destroyed. Blakesley had built that record through relentless, aggressive leadership. Blakesley retired from the Air Force in 1965 with the rank of colonel. He died on September 3, 2008 at age 90 and was buried at Arlington National Cemetery with full military honors. That is how wars are actually won. Not through brilliant generals or advanced technology alone, but through the work of thousands of people doing their jobs perfectly under impossible pressure. The pilots who flew into the most dangerous skies in the world every day, the crew chiefs who maintained aircraft through the night so pilots could fly at dawn, the engineers who solved fuel range problems with paper and glue, the factory workers who built drop tanks by the thousands. Each person did their part, and together they changed history. The P-51 Mustang over Berlin was not just about one airplane or one mission. It was about a system that worked. It was about people who saw a problem, found a solution, and made it happen. The official histories credit the Mustang's Merlin engine and aerodynamic design. Those things mattered. But they were not enough by themselves. The real breakthrough was the drop tank, a simple paper cylinder that gave American fighters the range to escort bombers anywhere in Europe. That tank was not developed in a laboratory. It was not the product of years of research. It was a pragmatic solution to an immediate problem, built by ordinary people using available materials. And it worked. Goering was right when he said the Mustang decided the war. But it was not just the airplane. It was everything that made the airplane effective. The range, the firepower, the reliability, the crew chiefs who kept it flying, the pilots who pushed it to its limits, the paper drop tanks that extended its reach beyond what anyone thought possible. All of it together, working as a system, overwhelming the Luftwaffe through persistence and volume and superior logistics. Germany could not compete with that. They had excellent aircraft. They had skilled pilots. But they did not have the industrial base, the training pipeline, or the fuel supplies to sustain the fight. The Americans did, and that made all the difference. If you found this story compelling, please like this video. It helps us reach more people who value these forgotten chapters of history. Subscribe to stay connected with more untold stories from World War II, and leave a comment below telling us where you're watching from. Our community spans the globe, from history students to veterans, from aviation enthusiasts to families preserving memories. You are part of something meaningful here. Thank you for watching. Thank you for remembering. These stories matter. These people mattered. And they deserve to be honored.